Daily Rambam for Wednesday, Chav Gimel Kislev, Taf Shin Pei Aleph, the fourth Perek, Perek Rabbi of Hilchos, Shvisas Yom Tov. So in this Perek, we're continuing more or less in vein of the previous Perek, discussing various details that relate to malachas that you may or may not be doing on Yom Tov. So Halacha Aleph deals with fire. So we know you're allowed to use fire on Yom Tov, but we'll see that there are limitations. You cannot create new fire from wood, stones, or metal. You rub them, you hit them until fire appears. Pure neft, it's like water-like. You can just sort of shake it until it catches fire. Like klizach, kasha, is chuchis, malaya mayim. You have a clear utensil. You have glass full of water. You put it with the sun, and it's supposed to be able to catch fire through the sun, through the glass. Until the light catches the flax and it catches fire. Yom Tov, this is all not allowed on Yom Tov.
It seems they're using the water as a form of magnifying glass.
Right, something like that. We mentioned previously, Hilchos Shabbos Perek that the Perek might say you're allowed to cook with a magnifying glass, but we mentioned then also you're not allowed to light with a magnifying glass. So that's also usher on Yom Tov. Oh, so what happened? I thought Yom Tov we can have fires. So what's the story? When we said Havar is allowed, it meant from an existing fire. But to make new fire is not okay. That's something could have done before Yom Tov. Now, arriving at the problem is it's moiled. You're creating something new. I didn't exactly say it that way. The Gemara says you're being moiled. The Bhagavad says though that this is not like a beitzah shenoiled. An egg is born. That's real noiled. But here, this is not something that the fire itself isn't anything. You can't say I have some fire in my pocket. It's just it's what the fire can do for you. So that's why the way that Rambam explained it is better.
But in fire, it is moiled because you're going in a pile. That's the whole idea of fire. Mm-hmm. It's that at least when we look at it today, the molecules are in a rested state.
Yeah.
When you hit them hard together, you create friction.
Right.
It's that time you're going. It's right. So that is bria.
Right. But he's talking about the outcome, the product that you created is not a davar haroi ba'atzmai. And he says, that if you went ahead and you made the fire anyway, you would be allowed to use it, and it's only usher because you shouldn't have done it now, but there's nothing inherently wrong with what you did. Look, Alter Rebbe says that the problem with Alter Rebbe phrases the problem with making fire in Yom Tov is p'nei moiled davar chadash. That's how Alter Rebbe says it. You're making something new, like the way the Gemara said it, and it's a doimek tzas l'malacha. It's like a malacha, and since you could have done it on Erev Yom Tov, also to do it on Yom Tov. And Alter Rebbe also says if you went ahead and you made the fire, you're allowed to use the fire on Yom Tov because there's no knas for malacha on Yom Tov the way there's a knas for doing malacha on Shabbos. So it's good to keep in mind if you accidentally light a fire on a stove, it's not a problem to use it. Halacha Beis, kibui, putting fires out. Even though we said not only you're allowed to light fires on Yom Tov, it doesn't even have to be for any particular purpose, right? Carrying on fires. But also, you're not allowed to extinguish it, even if it was made for eating. Because extinguishing is a malacha in its own right. It in no way advances, it doesn't help you get your food ready. And just like you can't extinguish a fire for cooking, you can't extinguish a candle. And kiba, and if you go ahead, you get malchus. It's like going and doing any other malacha. There's really even though psychologically it feels like it's related to fire, and fire is okay, it's not. It doesn't work like that. Halacha gimel. Aim the salkin. Now we talk about different forms of kibui. Aim the salkin is pi haner l'mayla kadesh tichva. You have a lamp. So you have a lamp with the wick coming out from the top. So what if you sort of tilt the whole lamp backwards? The oil goes down, the wick is up. That's sort of a way of putting the fire out. You can't do that. You can't just take the oil out either. You know from this Hilchos Shabbos as well. You can't sort of trim the wick with a utensil. But you are allowed to sort of press it with your finger, and that spreads the head of the wick out. And the Maggid Mishnah says this is the lamp in the beginning. It's a mice in the Gemara. It says Ula came to the house of Rav Yehuda, and Rav Yehuda's shamash took the Shraga and he put it upright. And Ula said, "I thought you're not allowed to do things that lead to mechava." Rav Yehuda said, "You're right. Lavadatoy. I don't take responsibility for what my shamash is doing." So that's how we know that everyone agrees it's a problem. If you have a bundle of wood that was lit for a big fire, any piece of wood where the fire hasn't caught yet, you're allowed to slip it out. It's not like taking oil out of a lamp. Taking oil out of a lamp is like reducing the fire, but here, individual pieces of wood, if it didn't catch fire yet, it's not considered reducing the fire. Halacha Daled. What if you have a need? What if there is a tzarech yomtiv, seemingly to put out a fire? If you can't extinguish a conflagration, there's a flame a fire that broke out, because you want to save the property, whatever is about to get burned. Just like you wouldn't be able to do so on Shabbos, as we learned in Hilchos Shabbos, and we discussed it over there, and discuss practically why we're very makel today, but you have to let it go and leave. There's another tzarech yomtiv, right? You're not supposed to have a fire, you're not supposed to have a light in the bedroom, tasha shamita. So can I put out the fire? No. Either put a keli over it, or make a mechitza, or carry it out. We're going to talk next halach about carrying fire. And if for some reason you can't do any of these things, does that mean that you can put it out now? No. It's still not allowed. So instead, you're not allowed to tasha shamita until it goes out on its own. So the Maggid Mishnah mentions that there's a Gemara. Abaya asked Rava, are you allowed to put a fire out on Yom Tov? So the Gemara says, if there's sakanas nefashis, there's no question. Even on Shabbos, you're allowed to. The question is, if you're just losing money, and he told them it's awesome. We already mentioned this Gemara when we learned Hilchos Shabbos Perek Beis. The Maggid Mishnah mentioned it there. He said, what's the marker Lagabi Shabbos that Pikuach Nefesh is always doichak? He brought this Gemara from Beitza about Yom Tov that Gemara said, hey, sakanas nefashis, no shayla. Click it out there, Shulchan Aruch, Simon Tav Kuf Yudalad. The Alter Rebbe says it's also part of a fire on Yom Tov, even if you see your house is burning down, unless it's a chash, sakanas nefashis, which in which case, even on Shabbos, you'd be allowed to. But Medver, more of the Alter Rebbe and Halacha Beis, when you're extinguishing it simply because you're losing your money. But what if there's a tzarech achila in putting out the fire? Because that's very important at Yom Tov to be able to eat. What if you didn't finish your Sudas Yom Tov? And if your house burns down, then how are you going to have Sudas Yom Tov? So it's tzarech achila. Until now, it was just tzarech mammon in general. Here it's mamish tzarech achila. We're very into making sure you can have your Yom Tov meal.
The same thing is for Shabbos, by the way. If the house is burning, you're allowed to take out enough depends what time of the day the house is burning.
Right, that's taking out. Here we're talking about being able to put it out, doing the malacha of kiboy because of tzarech achila. Until now, we've been basically every attempt we tried to make to say, oh, there's a tzarech. We're saying no, it's not a tzarech. So what if there's a direct tzarech achila in the extinguishing? So the Alter Rebbe says in that case would be mutter because it's like machshiri eichel nefesh. So if you can actually have that scenario. However, if you have another place to eat, even if it's a guy's house, it's the lasser. And Alter Rebbe says if you don't put out the fire, it's going to burn all your silverware, all your dishes. And you don't have other dishes to eat, and you don't have anyone to borrow from, and you'll also lose your meal that way if you don't put out the fire. There'll be another reason to put it out. So those are the cases where you can actually get a heter simply to save your Yom Tov meal. And the Alter Rebbe also mentions here that if you have a log of wood, a piece of wood that's it's not burning your house down, but it's causing a lot of smoke, you're not allowed to put it out, even though you don't have another place to eat, and you're going to have to sit with smoke in your eyes. Even though, interestingly, in today's Pesachim, we mentioned Gabi Shabbos, that even that's considered a reason. If you have zkenim or your children, having a smoke-filled home could be even a reason to do kibbutz and Shabbos. But at least here in Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch with Yom Tov, Alter Rebbe says that's not considered tzarech achila. Halacha, hey, carrying. Mutter l'taltel saner v'udalak. You're allowed to carry the fire and Yom Tov while it's lit. Ve'en geizin shema yichba. There's no gzeira that you might extinguish it. You're not allowed to put the fire up in a tree, because if it's in a tree and you're allowed to deal with the fire on Yom Tov, so then you might come to touch and use the tree on Yom Tov. Maggid Mishnah says, this is a Gemara in Shabbos that says you're allowed to put the fire on the tree on Shabbos, and you're not allowed to put the fire on a tree on Yom Tov. And I already discussed it there in Shabbos Perek Chamishi. If you look back in Shabbos Perek Chamishi, so there was one line, I don't know if we still remember it from there, but the Rambam said, you're allowed to put the Shabbos licht in a tree. And the Maggid Mishnah said, this Gemara, that for how to work for Shabbos, if you put it there Erev Shabbos and then you're going to stand there all Shabbos next to the tree, why are you allowed to do that? Because on Shabbos you don't go near the fire. So if you don't go near the fire, you're not going to go near the tree. On Yom Tov, if you do go near the fire, so you might go near the tree. So that's the difference. So it's like a chumrah on Yom Tov l'gabe Shabbos. Halacha Vav. Some more details relating to fire and putting out fire. Ein ma'ashin b'kteiros b'Yom Tov. You're not allowed to have incense on Yom Tov because when you pour the incense on the fire, it partially extinguishes the fire. And you're not even allowed to smell it. And certainly not the process by which you give the whole house a good smell or your clothing. Shahu Asr, which is not allowed. Maggid Mishnah, before continuing, the Maggid Mishnah mentions that from the Gemara it's clear that even if you have a item of clothing that has the smell itself, that you shouldn't put it on other clothing so that the other clothing should catch the smell from this item of clothing, because that's Meiled Reach B'Begadim, which is a whole additional issue. And he says, Kol ze nichlal b'masha amar Rabbeinu shalagamer esakelim aser. The Rambam was not omitting that. That's all included in what the Rambam said. So even if it doesn't involve fire and smoke, if it's just putting something fragrant on top of other things, that would also be moel reach, would be not okay. You're allowed to smoke the fruit, which somehow ripens them or whatever it does, just like it's like roasting meat. If the way to prepare the fruits involves smoke, so that's like any other cooking. You can sweeten the mustard with a metal coal, with something very hot that's metal, but not with wood, because when you make contact with the mustard, it's an act of kiboy for the wood, but for the metal it's not, it's just a hot piece of metal. And you can extinguish, can put out a piece of wood so that you don't want it to ruin. You don't want the smoke to get into your pot. You don't want the smoke to get into your house. That was essentially what the Alter Rebbe we quoted earlier from the Alter Rebbe about the smoke in your house. So the question. Okay, 1 second. So the Alter Rebbe says, just like he had said that if it's going to be smoke in your house, so you also know how to put it out if it's going to put smoke in your dish and ruin your dish, because instead of putting out the fire, you could just throw it out. If it's a piece of wood that's on fire with smoke, just throw it outside instead. So why extinguish it? And if you actually need this piece of wood, because actually part of it is smoking, but the other part of it is actually it's burning very well, and that's actually the same piece of wood you're using for your pot. And you don't have another fire, just this one, and the only way to cook your pot is with one half. And the only way to save your pot is by extinguishing the other half. Then it is mutter l'chabes, because in this case, it's another example where the kiboy is tzarech eichel nefesh mamish, which this leads us to the contemporary question, which is, are you allowed to lower a flame on Yom Tov if it will save the dish? You need to lower the flame for this dish. It's the fire is too high. So the Igris Moshe Feinstein writes in his Shvisas, he says, if you're lowering the flame so it doesn't ruin the tafshil, it is mutter, according to Rav Moshe. And if you're able to leave this fire and light another fire that will be smaller, still, according to the Moshe, the other place can attack say better to light another one that's smaller. But Moshe says even if you have the option of lighting another one, you can still lower this one and not light another one, because if we already agreed that sometimes making the fire lower, kibui, could be l'tzarech echol nefesh, if we say that it's mutter sometimes l'tzarech echol nefesh, then it's equal. All things are equal here. You have two malachas. You can either start a new fire l'tzarech echol nefesh, or you can lower this flame l'tzarech echol nefesh. So what's the difference? Usually, only lighting a fire is l'tzarech echol nefesh, and putting it out is nab. In this case, both are. So there's no difference. However, if there's no tzarech bishul, if you just don't want you don't want the gas, you don't want the flame to be so high, that's like turning it out entirely. And if that's usher, then it would be usher also to make the flame lower. Like I said, there are other opinions. I guess everyone does whatever they do. Halacha Zayin and Ches, helping getting the flame going. Zayin. You're not allowed to blow on the fire with a special tool that's used for fanning, for blowing on the fire.
What is that called?
It was a word that didn't seem so useful to use, so I didn't make a note of it.
I don't know. It's
Kadesh.
bellows.
That was the word. Yeah.
They still use it today. Smitties still use it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, that's the word. Bellows. Kadesh. What's the problem with that? The problem isn't that you're blowing on the fire. You're allowed to make the fire bigger if that's what you need to do. Problem is, it looks too professional. Like you mentioned, it seems like something you would do if you're a smith. So that's not
it intensifies the flame.
Right, so that's not for home use. But you can get some other tube and blow. That would be okay. You're not allowed to make coals. You're not spin a wick to weave together the threads of the wick. Yeah. You're not allowed to sort of singe it with the flame to improve it. You can't cut a wick in half to get two wicks. So these are all like tikkun keli, and it's not directly lighting a fire. But you are allowed to sort of flatten it with your hand. You can soak it in oil. And if you want to split it, what you can do is you can put half of it in one lamp, half of it in the other lamp, and you light it in the middle. But and then it burns out the middle, and then you have two wicks lit in two lamps. That's something you could do. And you can't break earthenware or cut paper, whatever paper they had back then, papyrus, in order to roast on them. So these are things you probably could have done before Yom Tov. Let's slice by maliach, and you can't break a reed in order to turn it into some kind of poke that you can use to roast. To roast something, a salty thing. The Rambam says. Shaput shenirtza, let's say you have one of these poles, something like this, that actually got bent out of shape. Even though you would be able to just bend it back with your hand, so you're not allowed to. And if you have two utensils, two vessels, that the way they're produced attached, and then you want to separate them later. Two lamps, two cups. You cannot reduce them, break them into two. That's like making a keli. The Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tavkuf Tes on this topic of the shvud shenakam. So the Alter Rebbe says this is where the Alter Rebbe says it. If even in its bent state, you can still use it for roasting things without straightening it out, then it's also to straighten it out, even with your hand, because you're being tzarech and Yom Tov, something which is not necessary. It still serves its purpose. But if you're unable to use it for its purpose without fixing it, and you can't find another one, even by your neighbor, that you can borrow from, and you didn't have the ability to do it from Erev Yom Tov, let's say it got bent on Yom Tov, or even it got bent on Erev Yom Tov, but you didn't know until Yom Tov came, or even you knew, but it was right before Yom Tov, there was not enough time to do it, so then you are allowed to fix it on Yom Tov. But very interesting, it says, Ein moedin kein la'acher, you can't let people know this. It's not halacha you can announce, and if someone comes to ask this halacha l'maisa, he's asking, what do? I have this thing, it's bent out of shape, you cannot tell him this heter, Why? Because they shouldn't make a mistake to be matter, even in cases where you could have fixed it in Erev Yom Tov and you just didn't take care of it, which is, in that case, it's asur min haTorah to fix it on Yom Tov. Like any machshiri eichel nefesh that you could have done out of Yom Tov. You're really not allowed to do it. So it really depends on whether it was possible or not, and we're afraid that it's too close, too similar, so you can't announce the heter if you didn't have a chance before Yom Tov. But every person is allowed to do it mi'atzmai, as long as he doesn't do it in front of other people who don't know this heter, because once you do it in front of them, that's like telling them that it's mutter. And if it got bent on the first day of Yom Tov, you're not allowed to fix it on the second day of Yom Tov if you had enough time on the first day to fix it. And even though it's Yom Tov and you're not supposed to fix it, but Mikol Makim, since you make 2 days Machmas HaSafek, maybe the first day was a weekday, so it's like we say, you could have fixed it on the first day. Maybe the first day was a week, then you could have fixed it then, so you can't fix it the next day. Halacha Tes. Sharpening a knife. You're not allowed to sharpen a knife with the sharpener. But you can sharpen against wood or earthenware or stone. Here the Rambam says, you know, to announce this, so they don't come to use the sharpener. When is this said? When it can just barely cut, or there's just sort of a pagam on it, there's a bump. But if it's completely useless, then you shouldn't even use wood, because here you're a bit more pressed, and you might end up just using the sharpener. For this reason, a Talmid Chacham is not allowed to inspect the knife of an Am Haaretz on Yom Tov, because maybe the knife for shchita is going to have a bump. And the Chacham is going to say, you can't check with this because there's a bump. So what's the Am Haaretz going to go and do? He's going to feel encouraged to go sharpen it. But if the Chacham checked his own knife, then and he can lend it to a more ignorant person. There's the whole Arichas and the Farshim, on the halachas underlying this halach. We're not going to get into it. Looking at the Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, there in the same simon, Tafkuf Tes, the course of a few halachas, Daled Hey Vav Zayin. This is the way the Alter Rebbe says. The Alter Rebbe says if you have a knife, whether it has a pagam or whatever the problem is, it's dull. If you can't cut it at all, so like we said here, you're not allowed to sharpen it with the special sharpening because it's mitaken keli b'yom tov. Even if it got ruined on Yom Tov, you didn't have a chance before. Usually the rule is that if you can't do something from Erev Yom Tov, you can do it on Yom Tov. When it comes to a knife, there's an extra chumrah of the chachamim, because this happens very often, and most of the time you can borrow someone else's knife. So therefore, if you can't find another knife, Chacham didn't want to be mechalek, and they said it's always also to use the sharpener. However, the Alter Rebbe says, and here the Alter Rebbe is different from the Rambam. The Alter Rebbe is saying even if it's any yachalach klal, the Alter Rebbe says you are allowed to do it with a shinoi using something else, even if you could have done it out of Yom Tov, as long as you don't do it in front of someone who knows this heter. So you shouldn't go use a sharpener like the Rambam said, unless you do it in such a tricky way that it doesn't even look like you're sharpening it. Maybe it looks like you're cleaning it. Maybe it looks like there's shamnunis on it, there's some fat, and looks like you're just trying to get it off. If you're able to sharpen it in that kind of manner, then you could even do it in front of someone else. And whatever the case is, if you can't do it in front of other people, certainly you can't tell them halacha l'maisa, because, like we said, just like what Alter Rebbe said earlier with the shvud that bent, that the people that shouldn't know this, you can't tell them at all, even if they ask. But you can do it on your own if they don't see. And the Alter Rebbe adds, what if you don't mean to sharpen it? What if you're trying to just clean it? And then then for sure you can do it in one over the other, and you could even tell others, but you still can't use the sharpener to remove the grease. Or you can't tell others to do that, but you can do it yourself. And the Alter Rebbe also says finally that they're only rematter to do with a shinoi if it was still us. Earlier the Alter Rebbe said, but that was when he said that it was usher. Then he started talking about how it's mutter with a shinoi. At the end of that, he says that's if you can still cut al yedei atchak. But if you weren't able to cut it at all. So the Alter Rebbe didn't differ with the Rambam. The Alter Rebbe ultimately says that it's usher if you're unable to use it whatsoever, and even with a shinoi, it's not allowed. Because we're afraid you're going to go and use the shop. Okay. Halacha Yud. Splitting wood. You know how to use the specialized tools used for chopping wood. Ella, but kupis is like a big butcher's.
A log splitter is called.
Right.
Log splitter.
Yeah. So you can only use a
It's like
kupis.
V-shape.
So a kupis in the Mishnayos, the Gemara, I think it's usually spelled kaifetz. It's a big kind of knife, big kind of tool that the butchers use to cut, and apparently also has a bit like a hammer-like design. So the Rambam says a mallet. You can use the sharp side of a not the big wider side of Meshu. That side is like using an axe. And why can't you use an axe to chop wood on Yom Tov if you're allowed to chop the wood? You shouldn't do it the way you do it during the week. You should have done it before Yom Tov. In that case, why is it not completely awesome? Because what if you're going to end up with a big piece of wood and it won't catch fire, it's too big, and it's going to stop you from cooking. We don't want you to end up in that situation. And therefore, they decide, you know what, you could split the wood, chop the wood, but with a shinu. Anything similar, this is in essence a principle that applies to many things here, that why some things are mutter the way they are and also the way they are, it all depends on these factors. However, Shulchan Aruch and Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, Siman Tafkuf Aleph, it says, Achshav, we're not bucky, what's a kardim and what's a kaifetz. Yesh lahachmer, that you shouldn't split, you shouldn't chop the wood with any such tool, only a knife or with your hand. Halacha Yud Aleph, carrying wood. A woman shouldn't go among the wood to take a piece of wood which you can use for roasting. And you can't use a piece of wood beam as support for a pot or for a door. It's only mutter to carry it if it's to help you, to aid you in getting your fire burning, but otherwise it's seemingly muktzah. Looking at the Rebbe Shulchan Aruch Siman Tafkuf Beis, the Alter Rebbe says the same point. Only lahasaka, because it's miyuchad for that, but for not for hasaka, even the terach gufinu mekayman, it's also because it doesn't have a teres kli. It's like avonim, so it's mamash muktzah. And the Alter Rebbe says yesh oimrim, a dry wood, since they can all be used for burning, so they all are considered muchen for Yom Tov, and then none of them have muktzah, and in which case you can carry them even if you are not, you don't happen to be using them right now for the purpose of burning it. The Alter Rebbe says linyan halacha, you should be chayshish for the first svara of b'shasat chak. If you really need a piece of dry wood, you could rely on the second svara that it is not muktzah. Moving on from fires. Halacha Yud Beis. So you had these the stores the way they were set up in the time of Chazal, apparently maybe continuing on in the centuries afterwards. So you had these similar, I guess, to what you might find on the street now. Some of these booths, and the way you close them today, we have gates that come down. Back then, they had these boards that maybe turned on a hinge, and then you when you wanted to open it, you turned it on the hinge and it opened, and you were able to reach inside, and then you closed it, you couldn't get inside. So you're allowed to remove the tris and put it back, so you can get to the spices that are there. You shouldn't be held back from enjoying Yom Tov. Once it's said, when the hinge is in the middle of the board, spins around the middle. But if it opens from the side, it turns on the hinge from the side, then it's aser gzeira shema yiska. Is a gzeira that you might want to somehow fasten it and make sure that it's in place properly and do something that's not allowed. And then sir kol iker, and if there's no hinge at all, it's just something you stick in and pull out. I feel babayis mutalach, so you can even do that at home. Halach Yud Gimel. Kalim shehein mefutzalan. You have utensils that are essentially made up of parts You might have some kind of candelabra that's made up of sections. The kisei, v'shulchan, you have a chair, a table, that are made up of separate pieces. You are allowed to assemble them on yantiv, as long as you don't put it tightly. All of a sudden, we pull this out and we say, actually, there is no binyan when it comes to kalim. What happened on Shabbos? So, just 1 second. Let's finish the halacha. If you have stones in a bathroom, you're allowed to sort of straighten them out on Yom Tov, even though that also might be a form of binyan. Binyan raihu, mishum kvaydoi like gazru. It's temporary, and due to his honor, perhaps the honor of the person in the Beis HaKisei, so there's no gzeira. You look now to Rebbe Shulchan Aruch and Simon Tov Kuf Yud Tes, and you'll notice almost every halacha when I quote the Alter Rebbe, it's a different simon. It's really distributed very differently in Shulchan Aruch. It's all over the place. And Simon Tov Kuf Yud Tes, the Alter Rebbe says these kalim that are made up of parts or kais shel prakim, so you're allowed to put them together on Yom Tov without yiska, which the Alter Rebbe explains shel yechabram b'chayzik u'gvura, to fasten them with strength. So that way, if you are mechaber them, that would be baina makapatash. But as long as you don't do it that strong, it's mutter. Even though the whole year they're always put together quite strongly, we're not chayshish. Maybe you will, which is why we're usually chayshish on Shabbos, right? Because on Shabbos we came up in Hilchos Shabbos. You weren't allowed to. The question was whether you're even allowed to carry them, because you might come to put it together. So there's a chash on Shabbos that you might fasten it. But on Yom Tov, since Yom Tov is more kal than Shabbos, the Alter Rebbe says they weren't gezer kol kach, so you're even allowed to assemble them. And we say there's no binyan per se, but kalim, as long as you're not doing baina makva patish. Halacha Yud Daled. Setting up in line with what we said in Halacha Yud Gimel. This is about setting up a fire. So you want to make a large fire in Yom Tov. When you're assembling, when you're lining up the wood. So you shouldn't, if you're familiar with the mizbeach, pictures of how the wood is lined up neatly in rows, one on top of the other, you shouldn't do that. That also seems like baina. Even though it's temporary, also. So you see, usually binyan we say is also. The Beis HaKisei was the exception. And this is not an exception. So what do we do? So either you just dump all the wood without any particular order, or you do it but with a shinoi. Kate said, how you do it but with a shinoi? You do the top row, and you go in reverse. Instead of building up, you build down until you get to the bottom. The Kesef Mishnah has a comment on this halacha, and he says, the Rosh explains, when you make a big medura, there's essentially 4 rows of wood. Like he says, it's like the 4 sides of a box, and then you put the wood on top of them. So he's saying don't make the sides first. First put the elyonim, and then you put the wood supporting them under it. Halacha tes vav. Chinak data. Same principle for a pot. You have stones under a pot. One of the ways of setting up a pot in those days. So first you hold the pot, then you put the stones under it, not vice versa. Not the stones first and then the pot. It's like same with the bed. You hold the boards on top, and you put the legs on the even eggs. You want to make a pyramid of eggs. Don't put row on top of a row until you get a pyramid. You go the other way around. Somehow go down. Anything like that needs shinoi. Halacha tazayin. Halacha matters that relate to animals. You're allowed to remove the flies that really attach themselves to the animal. Even though you're causing an injury, a wound, which you're ordinarily not allowed to do on Shabbos, you're allowed to remove it from the animal. The Maggid Mishnah says that and the way he explains it is that you're using, the Gemara talks about ketanim, he says it means kalim ketanim. You're using small kalim, and the kalim cause the chabura sometimes. Another halacha relating to animals, you're not allowed to help the animal give birth by directly sort of pulling the baby out. But you can offer support. You do that. You hold it so it doesn't fall. And you blow on its nose to clear out the junk so it can breathe. You can help it nurse. If it's a kosher animal and the mother is sort of rejecting the child and doesn't want to take care of it, you can take stuff that the baby was born with, the shilia, and you can splash it on the baby animal, or to put a block of salt in the womb of the animal. We'll put it out to them in a moment how that's supposed to help. Either of which can help the kosher animal reconnect with its offspring. But if it's not kosher, you can't do these things because it doesn't need it. So how does Alter Rebbe say this? Look at the Siman Tov Kuf Chav Gimel. Alter Rebbe says you're not miyale, which means to pull the vlad out, but you can support it, to hold, like the Rambam said. And if the kosher animal rejects its offspring, you're allowed to spray this shmei shilya on it, and you're allowed to put the salt in the womb. How does the salt in the womb help? Alter Rebbe says, I think it's Gemara Rashi, that it's simply painful. It doesn't have any direct connection, but by putting the salt in the womb, it's painful to the animal and reminds the animal of the tsar haleda, and that somehow awakens the mercy of the animal. But you're not allowed to do this for a not kosher animal because you're doing tircha and yomtiv for no reason. It doesn't help at all for a not kosher animal. The way the Alter Rebbe says it is it never accepts the child after it rejected it. That's what it means. She'ena tzricha, it doesn't do anything. Now we're moving on. To toveling a keli that became tamei. Klishnet of yomtiv. The keli became tamei an erev yomtiv, and Allah Yud Chas by contrast will be if it became tamei on yomtiv. This is all became erev yomtiv. Emat bilan oisai be yomtiv. You're not allowed to immerse it on yomtiv. Zera shemayasha oisai b'tamas. The zera is if you know you're allowed to do it on yomtiv, melchatchila you'll wait till yomtiv. You won't do it erev yomtiv. And what if it's actually the water inside that you need to tovel? You want to by immersing the keli, the water in the keli is going to connect with the water in the mikveh, hashaka, and then become tahar. That's really what your main aim and objective is. So you can say, look, I'm just trying to be matar the water, and the keli becomes tahar memela. What if the keli was actually tahar for the purposes of truma? But as we know, in tumma and tahar, there's levels. You have to tovel it again for it should be worthy for kachim. You're allowed to. Anything like that, if it's not pure tumma and tahara, but higher levels. But if it became tamei on yomtiv itself, then you are allowed to because there's no gzeira here. You couldn't have done it before. Nitma kli. The mashkan tamei and shein vlada tumah erev yomtiv. What if the keli became tamei from impure liquids? Impure liquids are only a vlada tumah, not an ava tumah, which we'll learn about. As the Rambam himself is about to say, b'makaymai. So if it became tamei matbil in this manner, matbil and yomtiv, you're also allowed to, even though it became tamei in erev yomtiv, vishu tar minat teira, because this whole tumah doesn't even exist minat teira. So because of that. So we say in this case that's like toveling something that's not tamei. As we shall learn in Hilchos Avos HaTumas Perek Zayin. Umadlin b'tli tamei. What if you have a well and you want to draw water from the well? And which bucket do you happen to use? You happen to use a bucket that's tamei. Oh, what does that mean? That while you're lowering the bucket into the well, memela, you're toveling it. So you're allowed to do that. With tar me'elav, and it becomes tar on its own. Nida she'en lebegadim ha'ach. What if you have a woman who's a nida and she has to tovel, and she has clothing? The clothing she's wearing are tamei, I guess, from tumas nida. That makes sense. And whatever the case is, she needs to tovel her begadim. She doesn't have another set of begadim to change into. So Mariamis with tevelas with gadah, she can do a trick. Alpidin, the woman can tovel with her clothing on, as long as the clothing is very loose. So that's the din that Rambam is referring to, that she can tovel with her clothing and say, look, I'm just toveling myself. Oh, my clothing became tahar along the way. Moving on to the final section of the Perek that has to do with Mekach u'Memker. Dealings on Yom Tov. You test. There are a bunch of things that are prohibited on Yom Tov due to the Gzeira of doing business. You're not allowed to put a price on an animal that you're giving on Yom Tov. What you do is you, without stating anything, you find two animals that have the same value, and you establish that okay, these are whatever it is. We're not saying what they're worth, but they're worth the same. And you slaughter one, and you divide that. And the next day, you know this was the same value as the other animal. We go and figure out what the value of the second animal is, and then we thereby know how much the first animal was worth. And then everyone pays for the amount that they took on Yom Tov. And when they're dividing, don't say, oh, I'm taking a selah worth, 1 coin worth, you're taking 2 coins worth. You can't mention the names of coins. This guy takes a third, this guy takes a quarter, and you do the math of the money afterwards. Now, dealing with weights. When you're dividing, you can't use a scale to divide. You cannot use a scale whatsoever. Not even to use it as a scale, just to deposit meat there so it's out of the reach of the mice. You're not allowed to. If the scales are hanging in place, it looks like you're weighing with a scale. The tabach uman, also an expert butcher, can't even use his hand to say, a real expert can tell how much it weighs just from holding it. But also, you can't do the trick either of where you put a bowl with water and then you put the thing in the water and the water spills out and then you weigh the water. Can't do that trick either. And you can't make a raffle over portions. But you could make raffles over meat of karbanas on Yom Tov mitzvah so that it creates love and excitement for the mitzvah. You look in the Maggid Mishnah. The Maggid Mishnah says that the Rashba says that it's only asur derech mishkol if it's in a manner of weighing, but if there's an expert butcher who knows just by cutting how to cut a litra size or a chatz litra, he knows how to cut a pound, he knows it in his mind just by cutting. He can weigh it, so to speak, without weighing it, but by cutting it. That's a different pasha, the Maggid Mishnah says. And the Maggid Mishnah also mentions that we already mentioned Hilchos Shabbos, that we mentioned at the end about the raffles, you're allowed to make a lottery for your family. That Rambam already mentioned in Perek of Gimel on Shabbos. And the Rambam didn't have to mention it here, because if it's mutter on Shabbos, for sure it's mutter on Yom Tov, so the Rambam is only talking about the Kodshim, which is its own topic. We're not going to get into that. If you look at the Rabbi Shulchan Aruch and Siman Tov Kuf, the Rabbi says, you're not allowed to weigh on Yom Tov, you shouldn't do what you do during the week. And even to weigh meat at home for your recipe, right? Until now, the Rambam was talking about weighing from the store. But Alter mentions even to weigh at home for a recipe, you're not allowed to. Even if you're not being careful and you're being careless with the weighing, it's more or less, still asur. It's also asur to hold the scale, the weight in one hand, and hold the meat in the other hand, and you can sort of get a sense based on, turn yourself into a scale. And you're also not allowed to sort of weigh one portion across another portion, what the other portion weighs. But you're allowed to weigh it in your hand by just holding the piece in your hand, and that's it. And then comes what the Rambam said about the tabach uman, the butcher, who can mamish tell exactly by holding it in his hand, he's not allowed to. But if the butcher isn't trying to sell it, he's just weighing it to know how much he wants to cook, if it's for a recipe, then he's allowed to even weigh it in his hand, because it's not for selling. The more details there, look there in Siman Tov Kuf. Halacha Chavalaf, talking to the merchant. You can't tell the butcher, give me a coin of worth of meat. A portion, half a portion. The next day you calculate what it was worth. You can't take from the store based on a certain measurement. So what do you do? You tell the merchant, fill up this utensil. And the next day you figure out, what did you fill up, or what was that worth? And even if it's a measuring cup, you're allowed to fill it up. As long as you don't mention, you don't speak, you don't mention anything about a measurement. And the Kasaf Mishnah says that Or did I finish the? No. So yeah. So the last halacha that Rambam said, last din, the Rambam said even to kli hamayuchad. That's the real nusach in the Rambam. You should know that Turner ben Yeruchim say that the Rambam asers b'kli hamayuchad lamida. They must have the wrong gears in the Rambam, because the Rambam that we have says that as long as you don't say, it's fine. Halacha chaf beis. Measuring. Anachtoim moedid tvolim b'noisen lakdeira. A baker is allowed to measure spices and put it in the pot in order not to ruin his tafshil. Isha, like tamweit kamach leisa, a woman should not measure flour for a dough. And he shouldn't measure barley for his animal, but just sort of estimate and give. Looking at the Rebbe Shulchan and Simon Tavkav Daled, even though it's also to measure on Yom Tov, it's mutter for anyone to measure spices. According to certain measurements, it doesn't ruin your recipe. And now that even during the weekday, we don't measure our spices and we just sort of estimate. We're not afraid that we're going to ruin the dish. It's interesting to know what people do nowadays in their homes. I imagine some might and some might not, because there are people today who are, when they make a recipe, they do measure every single time. It sounds like according to the Alter Rebbe, if we have the liberty of changing the halacha according to the circumstances, it sounds like if you always measure and it's going to ruin your dish if you don't measure, then it might be mutter. So I guess it might depend. Halacha chav gimel. Getting back to going to the store, continuing that. You're allowed to go to the store owner and take eggs or nuts by a certain number, but anything like that. As long as you don't mention the name of a coin or you don't actually name the amount. How does that work? Let's say he already owes the store owner, he already owes him for 10 pomegranates or 10 nuts. You shouldn't say, give me another 10. No, now it's going to be 20. You take without saying anything. You do the calculations the next day. Similar for animals. You go to you want to buy an animal, so either you go to the shopper that you usually go to, or to the guy who fattens the animals. You take whatever number of animals you need, as long as you don't mention a number or amounts of money. Now, the Maggid Mishnah points out that there's an issue here of Goyim versus Yidden. That you're allowed, the Brisa says you're allowed to take from Goyim and Yidden, except for things that it might be mechuber. And there's a chashash that it was noilad today or captured today, in which case you're not allowed to take from the Goy unless you cleared up the suffix, you know for a fact that it wasn't plucked or captured today. And the Rashba, Maggid Mishnah quotes the Rashba, who says you're allowed to take eggs from a Goy the night of Yom Tov, because Yeledes Balayla is miuta de miuta, so we don't think it just happened. Mm-hmm. But once it's by day, this is a davar sheish matirin. You wait till after Yom Tov. Until then, it's aser. Look, if you want to know some more details on this, dealing with a guy in Yom Tov, looking out at Rabbi Shulchan Aruch Siman Tov Kuf Yud Zayin. Halacha Chav Hey. Halvas Yom Tov Tevin Eisa B'din. If you lend someone, obviously not money, but you're lending him food, Tevin Eisa B'din, you're allowed to go to Beis Din after Yom Tov and say, you literally owe me this, it's a real halva, you treat it like a real halva. Shem Taimar, if you say that, no, it's not something you can actually claim in court, then no one's going to want to lend anything, and then that takes away from people's enjoyment of Yom Tov. Look at Maggid Mishnah. The Maggid Mishnah says Machlekes in Gemara. And in the Rif, he writes that the Go'anim disagreed about what the actual psak is, and the Rif himself did not want to decide. The Rambam took a side. The Rambam said that you are allowed to collect it. And I believe the Alter Rebbe also writes this. Halacha Chav Vav, final halacha. Al Vishem Akbin Truma Ma'aser Yom Tov Shabbos. Even though you're not allowed to separate Truma Ma'aser Yom Tov, just like you're not allowed to do so on Shabbos. But if you'd already separated them before, you can bring them to the Kohen Yom Tov and say, here's your Simchas Yom Tov, here, enjoy. And Tzarech Leimar, and obviously it goes without saying, Chalu Ziroi L'Chayayim V'Keva, these other matnas Konosh Melichan L'Kohen Yom Tov, you can bring them to the Kohen. And final din, those who collect for tzedakah, they can go from yard to yard and collect on Yom Tov. They shouldn't make announcements the way they do during the week. They do it quietly, and they put it under their arm. And then they distribute it to every neighborhood. No, we're talking about food.
Oh, food, yeah.
So during the week, they make a bigger deal out of it. And here on Yom Tov, you do it in a more subtle kind of way, but you're allowed to do it.
Shkoyach.